Texas ranch country is supposed to feel eternal. The fences, the cattle guards, the mesquite, the water tanks, the family names on old gate signs, all of it looks like it has always been there and always will be. But that is the illusion, because across Texas, the country people imagine when they imagine Texas is being broken apart. Not all at once, not in some cinematic collapse. It disappears quietly, in probate court, in appraisal districts, in groundwater fights, in sale contracts, in widening highways, in the arithmetic of children who cannot afford to come back. And what makes this story tragic is not just that land is changing hands, it is that an entire territorial order is dying. The ranch was never just a business, it was a system for holding power across generations. And now, in the state that mythologized it more than any other, that system is beginning to fail. Chapter 1. The country people think is forever. There is a particular kind of stillness in Texas ranch country that makes you feel like time has stopped making decisions. You drive out past the last hardware store, past the grain elevator, past the water tower with its faded town name, and then the road narrows and the world opens, and there it is. The mesquite twisted into its old shapes, the pasture grass gone silver in the afternoon light, a windmill turning slowly against a sky so wide it makes everything underneath it feel small and ancient and permanent. A cattle guard rattling under your tires, a gate with a family name welded into the ironwork, a name that has been on that gate for longer than most American institutions have existed. People see that and they believe something. They believe this has always been here. They believe it will always be here. They believe Texas is, underneath everything else it has become, the highways, the suburbs, the glass towers, the data centers, still fundamentally this, still the ranch, still the open country, still the place where family names on iron gates mean something permanent. That belief is not stupid, it comes from somewhere true. Because ranch country in Texas is not a remnant. It is not a park, not a museum, not a scenic corridor set aside between the real uses of the land. More than 95% of all land in Texas is privately owned or managed. The working landscape, the ranches, the pastures, the creek bottoms, the family operations that have passed through 3 and 4 and sometimes 5 generations, that landscape is not the exception in Texas. It is the state itself. And that is exactly what makes what is happening now so difficult to see clearly. Because what is disappearing is not just acreage. What is disappearing is the system, the arrangement, the logic by which a piece of Texas held together as a ranch and not as something else. It disappears quietly. There is no single catastrophe, no drought that ends it all in one season. It happens in probate court when the will gets complicated. It happens in the appraisal district when the tax bill becomes something the operation cannot carry. It happens when the grandchildren count what they would inherit and what they would owe and decide the math does not work. It happens when a water buyer makes an offer that no cattle check could ever match. Each of those moments feels individual, private, like something happening to one family on one piece of land for reasons specific to them. But when you step back and look at the scale, you see that it is happening everywhere at once, and that it has been building for a very long time. This is not a story about development villains and rancher victims. The real story is harder and stranger and more honest. It is a story about a territorial order, about the whole system by which Texas was turned into ranch country in the first place, who that system served, how it survived things that should have ended it, and why, after centuries of resilience, It is now coming apart in ways that no amount of nostalgia can reverse. The country that looks eternal is not eternal. It never was, and understanding why it is disappearing now requires understanding how it was built in the first place, because the same forces that made Texas ranch country what it is are the forces now taking it apart. Chapter 2. The Disappearance. Hiding in plain sight. The signs are not dramatic. That is the first thing people get wrong when they try to see this. They expect something visible. A billboard announcing a new subdivision, a ribbon cutting. But the disappearance of Texas ranch country does not usually announce itself. It moves through paperwork, through county records and deed transfers and appraisal notices that nobody outside the family ever sees. It moves through a for sale sign on a pasture road that used to run clear to the horizon and now terminates at a gate you have never seen before. You will see a new asphalt driveway going somewhere it never went. You will see a pond that used to be part of a working operation now stocked for weekend fishing. You will see houses at intervals where there were no houses, each one on its own small parcel, each one requiring its own well and its own fence line, and its own separate relationship to the land that once held together as a single working whole. This is what fragmentation looks like from the road, and from the road it looks almost reasonable. It looks like people making individual choices about land they own. It looks like freedom. It looks, in the way that Texas tends to frame these things, like the market working exactly the way it is supposed to work. But here are the numbers that change how the picture looks. Between 1997 and 2022, Texas added roughly 11 million new residents. That is 11 million more people needing roads, power lines, water infrastructure, housing, commercial space, all of it cutting through and over the working landscape. 88% of that population growth landed in just the top 25 highest growth counties. In 25 years, approximately 3.7 million acres of Texas working lands were converted to non-agricultural uses. Nearly 1.8 million of those acres were converted in just the 5 years between 2017 and 2022. That is more than 800 acres per day, every day, for 5 years. The 2022 Census of Agriculture counted 230,662 farms and ranches covering 125.5 million acres, but since 2017, Texas had already lost more than 17,700 farms and over 1.6 million acres from that total. 800 acres per day is not a tragic statistic. It is a tempo. A rhythm of conversion that does not pause for droughts or recessions or the price of cattle. It just continues. The pressure concentrates around the cities and along the corridors between them. The I-35 corridor between San Antonio and Dallas, the expanding outer rings of Houston, the hill country counties that Austin's growth has been swallowing for 2 decades. A property that sat 45 minutes from the nearest city in 2005 might now sit 20 minutes from a major suburb in 2025. The math of that transition does not favor the cattle operation, it favors the developer. And the rancher sitting on land that appraises at $7,000 an acre, trying to run an operation that needs 500 acres minimum to break even, is doing a calculation that the market has already made for them, because the landowner who sells is not a traitor. In most cases, they are a family, fractured across a generation, unequal in their desire to continue, unequal in their ability to carry the tax burden. The child who stayed and worked the land for 30 years is not necessarily in the same position as the child who left for Houston or Austin or Dallas, who has a career and a family and no particular need for a pasture in a county they visit twice a year. When those 2 children inherit jointly, The ranch has already started to end, not because anyone chose to end it, but because the structure of inheritance and the reality of modern economic life make it extremely difficult to keep together. It does not feel like conquest. It does not feel like theft. It feels like arithmetic. A series of individually rational decisions adding up to something collectively devastating, the dismantling of a landscape that no single person chose to dismantle. The disappearance is hiding in plain sight, and it has been hiding there long enough that the people who should be alarmed have had time to get used to it. Chapter 3. This was never just land. Before we go any further into what is being lost, it is worth being precise about what a ranch actually is, because it is not what most people think it is. The popular image is simple: a man, a family, cattle, land, hard work, independence. The ranch, as the purest expression of something elemental about American life, self-sufficiency, space, the moral clarity of physical labor in an open landscape. That image is not entirely false, but it leaves out almost everything that makes a ranch function and survive across generations. A ranch is not just land. A ranch is a legal claim. It is a set of water rights, mineral rights, grazing rights, access rights, a whole architecture of entitlements that took decades or sometimes centuries to assemble. A ranch is a tax strategy. It exists in a specific relationship to appraisal law and agricultural exemptions, and when those laws change, or when the land's market value outpaces what any agricultural operation can produce, the ranch becomes harder and harder to justify legally and financially. A ranch is a succession plan. It assumes that someone will come next, that the next generation will accept the obligation, that the family will stay coherent enough across time to hold something together that the market would otherwise pull apart. And a ranch is a social instrument. It is how a family signals its standing, who they marry, what county offices they hold, which water board they sit on, which roads get improved and which do not. For much of Texas history, to hold ranch land at scale was to hold power, not in a metaphorical sense, but in the direct material, practical sense of controlling the water and grass and roads that everyone around you needed. When a ranch breaks apart, something more than acreage changes hands. A form of power changes hands. A form of continuity ends. A relationship to place, to specific creek beds, specific pastures, specific fence lines, repaired by specific hands over specific decades, is severed, usually permanently, and replaced by something that has no memory of what came before it. 12.1 million head of cattle and calves as of January 1st, 2026. 17,000 farms lost since 2017 alone. 1.6 million acres removed from agricultural use in 5 years. Landowners who are only about 1% of the state's population, but who make decisions about land covering the overwhelming majority of Texas's surface area. What makes this particular loss different from other things that vanish in the course of economic change is that there is no natural replacement. When a working ranch fragments into ranchettes and recreational parcels and water rights sales and highway frontage, you cannot simply reassemble it. The scale is gone. The water infrastructure decays or gets dedicated to non-agricultural uses. The knowledge of how to run that specific land in that specific way walks out the door with whoever is last to leave. And the land gets managed by someone who flies in on weekends and does not particularly need it to produce anything. When a ranch dies, something larger than a business dies with it. The argument about what exactly that something is, whether it was noble, whether it deserved to last, whether its passing should be mourned or understood or both at once, That argument is the real subject of everything that follows. Chapter 4. Empire. Drew the first lines. To understand why Texas ranch country is disappearing now, you have to go back to the beginning of how it was created. And the beginning is not the cowboy. The beginning is the empire. Long before anyone drove a longhorn up a trail to Kansas, long before barbed wire, long before the cattle baron in his big house at the center of the range, someone with a pen and a seal and the authority of a crown drew a line on a map and said, "This belongs to this person now." That act, the land grant, is where Texas ranch country actually begins. Land grants were not gifts. They were instruments of territorial control. The earliest land grants in what would become Texas date to 1716. By 1731, town lots in San Antonio were being formally granted to settlers. By 1753, colonists in South Texas were formally requesting large livestock grants. By 1767, those lands were being formally surveyed and transferred into private possession. Long before Texas became American, the basic framework of private land control was already running. The land that became the great ranches was not empty when the grants were made. It was used by indigenous peoples who did not recognize the colonial authority making the grants and who had no legal standing within the system being built around them. The private ranchers who eventually displaced the missions did so not by going outside that system, but by using it more aggressively. By 1787, a single roundup in Spanish Texas branded more than 7,000 cattle. Not a frontier moment, but an organized, legally structured livestock operation inside a colonial land regime that had been running for decades. Understanding that origin matters because it explains something that would otherwise seem paradoxical about what is happening now. The same legal and cultural traditions that protected ranch families for generations, private property rights, the sanctity of title, the idea that land belongs to whoever holds the deed, are also the traditions that make it impossible for the state or the public to intervene when those families decide to sell. The ranch country was built on private property, and it is being dismantled by private property. The same system, the same logic, turned in a different direction. This is not a design flaw. This is the design. A territorial order built on individual legal title to land will always be subject to the pressures of markets, inheritance, and economic change. The Spanish Empire built a land system in Texas because it wanted to control a territory. What it could not predict was that 3 centuries later, that same system of individual title and transferable ownership would make it impossible to preserve the landscape the system had organized. The land was never really the land. It was always a legal claim. And legal claims, unlike limestone and mesquite, can be converted. They can be subdivided. They can be sold. Chapter 5. Before the cowboy, the vaquero. There is a version of Texas ranch history that starts with the Anglo cowboy, the man on horseback riding into open country, building something from nothing, defining through sheer will and physical courage an entirely American way of life. That version is not a lie exactly, but it is a story that begins in the middle, and it leaves out almost everything that made the thing it is celebrating possible. The cowboy did not invent the techniques of cattle ranching. He inherited them. The saddle he rode, the rope he threw, the vocabulary he used, reata, remuda, vaquero, chaparral, arroyo, bronco, lasso. These are Spanish words because the practices they describe came from Spanish and Mexican ranching traditions that were already centuries old when the first Anglo settlers arrived in Texas. The legal concepts that governed grazing rights, The practice of branding to establish ownership, the logic of driving cattle to distant markets, the whole framework of mounted livestock management, all of it was already running in Texas before the first Anglo rancher arrived. The vaqueros who worked the great Spanish and later Mexican ranches of South Texas were not background figures in someone else's story. They were the people who built and maintained the practical knowledge base that Texas ranching runs on to this day. The techniques they developed for working cattle in brushy, thorny, waterless country, specifically adapted to the mesquite and caliche and cedar of the Texas landscape, were the techniques that made the whole cattle economy possible. Without the vaquero, there is no cowboy. Without the Spanish land system and its livestock traditions, there is no Texas ranch country. By 1795, private ranchers had won enough political ground to get relief from earlier restrictions and taxes on wild stock. They had used the legal system, petitions, arguments, appeals to colonial administrators to improve their own position. This is not romanticism. This is politics. This is the ranch as a political entity using the levers available to it to protect and extend its own interests. It was true in 1795, and it was true 200 years later in Austin, and it is the continuity underneath the mythology that the mythology carefully hides. The myth says ranch country was built by rugged individuals who went out into empty land and made something from nothing. The history says it was built by people, Spanish colonists, Mexican settlers, indigenous knowledge holders, enslaved workers, vaqueros, Anglo ranchers, operating inside a set of legal and cultural systems that were already old and already complex when the first cattle crossed the Rio Grande. Texas ranch country did not come from nowhere. It came from somewhere very specific, very old, and very complicated. And the people who are watching it disappear now are the latest inheritors of a system that no single generation built, and no single generation is in a position to save. Chapter 6. Dynasties on the Range. In 1852, a steamboat captain named Richard King bought the rights to a sheep camp on Santa Gertrudis Creek for $300. It was a dry, thorny, difficult piece of country that most people considered barely habitable. But King saw scale. He saw what the land could become if you were willing to be patient and ruthless and legally creative in equal measure. King and his early partner, Gideon Lewis, began expanding through Spanish and Mexican land grants in 1853. They understood something that the mythology of the self-made rancher tends to obscure. The fastest way to build a large land holding in Texas was not to claim empty land. It was to acquire existing legal titles, Spanish grants, Mexican grants, the fractured inheritances of families operating inside an Anglo-American property regime that was often hostile to them. King was not just a cattleman, he was a legal strategist, working a land market destabilized by the transition from Mexican to American sovereignty, using that instability to accumulate title at a scale no individual rancher could accomplish by simply homesteading. By the time Richard King died in 1885, the ranch covered 825,000 acres, larger than Rhode Island. A permanent labor force, the Quinenos, lived and worked on the land for generations, giving the operation a social structure that was as much a feudal settlement as a modern agricultural business. When King died, his widow Henrietta King did not sell. She ran it. When she died, her son-in-law Robert Kleberg ran it. The ranch passed not through a single heir, but through a family corporation structured specifically to prevent the fragmentation that killed lesser dynasties. The structure is this: land at scale, held through a legal entity that outlasts any individual, maintained by a labor force with no other options, defended by relationships with law and government, and diversified aggressively enough to survive whatever the market throws at it. That is a formula that required not just hard work and vision, but political power, the kind that comes from holding more land than your county government has roads to maintain, more water than your neighbors have access to, more history than any challenger can overcome in a single generation. The ranch dynasty is not a business. It is a political order with cattle in it. And understanding that is essential to understanding why, when the dynasty falters, something larger than a business fails with it. King Ranch survived by doing what empires do when their original economy fails. It found a new one underneath the old one. Oil and gas exploration began in earnest after 1939 and accelerated dramatically after 1945. The cattle paid the operating costs. The oil paid for the dynasty. The question hanging over Texas ranch country now is whether the ranches that could not become King Ranch, the family operations of 10,000 acres or 20,000 acres, running on thin margins and older equipment, have anything left to adapt to, or whether they are simply at the end of the line. Chapter 7. When the Open Range Died the First Time. Texas ranch country has already died once. The world that the cowboy mythology is built on, the open range, the great trail drives, the cattle kingdoms of the 1870s, that world was gone by 1890. It did not fade gradually into something gentler. It ended in a specific crisis, triggered by a specific technology, and what came after it was not the same thing in a different costume. It was a different thing entirely. The technology was barbed wire. Before it arrived in Texas in 1874, most large-scale stockmen did not particularly need to own the grassland their cattle grazed. What you needed was access to water. Water controlled the range. If you held the springs, the creek crossings, the water holes, the points where cattle had to stop and drink, you effectively controlled the surrounding country without owning it. Barbed wire broke that logic. Once wire could cheaply enclose pasture, the value of holding fenced acreage rose dramatically. But the big ranchers who had capital began enclosing not just their own legal holdings, but public land and neighbors' land and roads that smaller operators had used for years without a deed. The small cattlemen who found themselves cut off from water and range they had relied on began cutting the fences at night. The fence-cutting conflicts of the early 1880s were not a minor footnote. They were open, organized, sometimes violent resistance to the enclosure of a commons that the open range system had maintained for decades. Bands of men rode at night with wire cutters. Fences were destroyed as fast as they were built. The Texas legislature eventually criminalized fence cutting in 1884, but by then the pattern was already set. Whoever had the capital to build and hold fences would win. The great trail drives to Kansas, the ones that made the cowboy myth, were essentially over by 1890, killed by a combination of wire, settlement, and the railroads that made them unnecessary. What survived the death of the open range was not the cowboy as he had existed, it was the landowner. The person who held not just cattle but land title, water rights, and the legal infrastructure to defend them. The open range died and the modern Texas ranch was born in its place, a creature of law and capital as much as grass and cattle. The reason this matters now is that it happened once before. The transition was wrenching and total, and what came out the other side was called by the same name, Texas ranch country, even though it was functionally a different thing. The question hanging over the present moment is whether what is happening now is another version of the same reinvention, or whether this time the thing that replaces ranch country will no longer be able to call itself by that name at all. The open range ended, and ranching survived. The question is whether ranching can survive its own land values. Because land values do not cut fences at night, they do not need to. They just wait. Chapter 8: Oil, Tax Law, and Reinvention. The death of the open range should have ended the great Texas ranches. By the logic of agricultural economics, the fenced ranch was a more expensive operation than the open range cattle drive, and the beef market was increasingly volatile. The dynasty should have started breaking apart in the early 20th century. It did not. And the reason tells you as much about Texas as anything else in this story. The first thing that saved the ranches was what was underneath them: oil. As drilling technology improved and petroleum demand grew, ranchers began to understand that their land was not just surface acreage. It was a platform sitting on top of a mineral economy of potentially enormous value. King Ranch built itself a position directly above one of the most productive petroleum-bearing formations in the state. Major oil and gas development accelerated after 1939 and surged after 1945. The cattle paid the operating costs. The oil paid for the dynasty. And while oil was buying time for the biggest operations, something was happening in Austin that would eventually shape the survival of Texas ranch country far more broadly. Texas tax policy was changing. Farm and ranch land had long been taxed at market value like any other property. As urban growth pushed land values in some counties faster than any cattle operation could track, the tax burden on agricultural land became a real existential threat. A rancher sitting on land the appraisal district now valued at $2,000 an acre, trying to run an operation that returned $50 an acre in a good year, was being taxed on the gap between those two numbers. The gap was slowly killing the operation. In 1978, Texas voters approved a constitutional amendment allowing qualifying agricultural land to be taxed on productive value, what the land was actually worth as a farm or ranch, rather than market value. The difference between those two numbers was, in some counties, enormous. In those counties, that policy change was the single thing that kept working ranches from being forced into sale by their own tax bills. Then, in 1995, the legislature added wildlife management as a qualifying use, allowing landowners who could demonstrate active management for native wildlife to qualify for the same productive value appraisal without running cattle at all. Wildlife management acreage in Texas was roughly 94,000 acres in 1997. By 2022, it had grown to approximately 7.1 million acres, a classification that did not exist as a tax category until 1995. Those 7.1 million acres are not being lost to subdivisions. They are being held by private landowners, often with genuine ecological benefit. But they are also not ranches in the traditional sense. Many are owned by people who bought ranch property as an amenity or tax strategy and found that wildlife management gave them a way to hold it at lower cost without the labor of running livestock. Is that conservation? Yes, in many cases. Is it the survival of ranch country? That depends on what you think ranch country actually is. Texas ranch country survived the death of the open range by becoming fenced, corporate, and mineral diversified. It survived the mid-20th century tax crisis by becoming legislatively protected. And now it is surviving, in some forms, in some places, by becoming a wildlife preserve, a recreational property, a tax-advantaged landscape asset for people who may have more in common with a hedge fund than with Richard King. The gate still says ranch. The question is whether that name is still telling the truth. Chapter 9. The Family Machine. Every ranch has a succession plan, whether anyone wrote one down or not. The plan is usually the same. The land stays in the family, the children who want a ranch do the work, the children who leave get something else, and the operation continues. That plan has worked in various forms for generations, and it is now failing at a rate and a scale that is quietly restructuring the entire Texas land economy. The failure involves something more ordinary and more difficult to argue with than a family crisis. It involves children who grew up on a ranch, who love it in the way you can only love something you have worked on since you were old enough to carry a fence post, and who have done the math and decided they cannot come back. The math is not complicated. You inherit a working ranch along with your siblings because that is usually how inheritance works, and rarely does every sibling want the same thing at the same time. The land is worth, in some counties, several $1,000s an acre. The operation earns a fraction of that per acre per year, in a good year, if the rains come and the market cooperates. So you add it up. You add what you would inherit, what it would cost to buy out the siblings who want to sell, what the operation could realistically earn, what you would need to invest in deferred equipment and infrastructure. And then you look at what you are making in Houston or Austin, and you make a decision that the mythology says is a betrayal, but that the economics says is entirely rational. Roughly 43% of Texas landowners are over the age of 65. Only 15% are younger than 44. Nearly half of all Texas agricultural operations are managed by just 2 landowners, often a couple in their 60s or 70s, which means that when one of those 2 is gone, the entire operation rests on one person who may or may not be able to carry it. 13% of all Texans are over 65. 43% of Texas landowners are over 65. That gap between the age of the general population and the age of the people who hold the land is the most important number in this story. There is a particular kind of grief in a family meeting where the ranch comes up. The parent who built or maintained the operation sits at the head of the table, knowing that at least one of the children in the room is going to say they cannot do it. The sibling who stayed to work the land faces the sibling who left and is now, legally, an equal heir to everything the staying sibling sacrificed for. The question of what the land is worth in dollars that the probate court can divide hangs over a table where everyone knows the number and nobody wants to say it. The ranch as a machine for turning land into family continuity is seizing up. The gears that kept it running, obligation, proximity, limited alternatives, cultural pressure, the sheer difficulty of imagining a life somewhere else, are wearing down, and when the machine stops, the land does not disappear. It just becomes something else, something that does not require a family to operate it, something that does not remember what it was. Chapter 10. The state got richer than the landscape. Could bear, there is a story. Texas tells about itself. The state growed because it was doing something right. The economy was strong, the taxes were low, the opportunity was real, and people came. 11 million new residents in 25 years, nearly 1,100 people arriving every single day. That story is not false. Texas grew because it offered things people wanted. But every story about growth has a second half. The second half is about what growth costs. And in Texas, one of the things that growth costs is the landscape that made Texas legible as a place in the first place. When a major metropolitan area expands, when its suburbs push out, and its commuter corridors extend, land values in the surrounding counties rise. Not because those counties have changed, not because the grass is different, or the water table has shifted, or the cattle market has improved, but because proximity to urban employment and services creates demand that the rural land market was never designed to absorb. The rancher who held their land for 40 years at a value their cattle operation could justify is now sitting on an appraisal number that reflects not what their land can do agriculturally, but what someone with a different use in mind is willing to pay for it. In 2017, the average statewide market value of Texas working lands was $1,951 per acre. By 2022, that number had risen to $3,021 per acre. That is a 55% increase in 5 years. By late 2025, the Texas Real Estate Research Center's statewide rural land price indicator had reached $5,214 per acre. In the Austin, Waco, and Hill Country region, the epicenter of Texas's growth pressure, that number was $7,911 per acre. A well-run cow-calf operation in Texas might generate somewhere between $30 and $80 per acre per year in a good year. On land appraising at $7,000 an acre, that return is less than 2% annually on the asset's market value. No investor would accept that return. And every year, land values rise faster than agricultural income. The gap between what the ranch is worth sold and what it is worth operated grows wider and more difficult to ignore. The growth does not stop at the county line. It radiates. A county 2 counties over from a major metropolitan area will feel the pressure within a decade. The roads improve. The broadband arrives. Small towns that were once genuinely remote become commutable. And once a place becomes commutable, its land values begin tracking the metropolitan economy rather than the agricultural one. Texas may be the only state where prosperity and disappearance are the same story, where the growth generating the state's economic confidence is simultaneously consuming the landscape, generating the state's cultural identity. Nobody moved to Texas to destroy ranch country, but the effect is the same whether the intention exists or not. The land does not care why the values are rising. It only registers that they are. Chapter 11. Fragmentation, the Quiet Death. The word that keeps appearing in the research on Texas land loss is fragmentation. It is a precise word, and it is worth understanding exactly what it means, because it describes something that looks almost harmless from the outside and is in practice fatal to working agriculture. Fragmentation is not the same as conversion. Conversion is when ranch land becomes a subdivision or a highway, when it leaves agricultural use entirely. Fragmentation is quieter. It is when a ranch is divided into pieces, each individually too small to support the agricultural use that made the whole viable. Each piece might still technically be called a ranch. It might still have a barn, a pasture, a few cattle, but the scale is gone. And without scale, the economics of running cattle, maintaining water infrastructure, and justifying equipment costs stop working. Fragmentation happens generationally. A ranch whole under the grandfather gets divided 3 ways when the children inherit, and one sibling needs to sell their share. 2 children keep their portions as working operations, smaller than the original but still functional. The 3rd piece gets bought by someone from Dallas who wants a weekend property, runs a few cattle for the exemption, builds a house. The next generation of that family divides again. And what was one 10,000-acre operation is now, 2 generations later, 5 or 6 parcels managed by people with varying commitment to agricultural production, no longer sharing infrastructure or the knowledge of how the whole piece of land worked together. By 2022, farms and ranches under 100 acres made up 60% of all Texas agricultural ownerships, but controlled only 3% of all working land acreage in the state. 3%. Meanwhile, operations over 2,000 acres, the ones large enough to run viable commercial cattle operations in most regions, lost more than 1,000 individual holdings between 2017 and 2022 alone. Texas lost more than 17,700 farms and ranches total in that 5-year window. The small parcels are multiplying, the large ones are collapsing, and the agricultural use that requires scale is losing its foundation. There is an argument that fragmentation is democratic, that breaking large holdings into smaller ones distributes land more equitably. That argument is not wrong on its face, but cattle ranching is not a use that scales down gracefully. A 200-acre property cannot support a viable commercial operation in most of Texas. The fragmentation of large ranches does not create a class of small working ranchers. It creates a class of amenity landowners on parcels that used to be part of something functional. And once a ranch fragments, it almost never reconsolidates. The knowledge of how the whole piece worked, where the springs ran, where the cattle moved seasonally, what the creek did in a wet year, dissipates with the generation that held it. You can own the acres, but you cannot own what the acres knew. That is what fragmentation actually costs. Not the acreage, which is still there, still under the same sky, but the coherence, the memory, the working logic of a landscape that took generations to learn and cannot be recovered once the people who held it are gone. Chapter 12. Water changes everything. Everything in this story has been moving toward water. The land grants were really about water. The open range was controlled through water. The fence-cutting wars were fought over water. The great cattle operations were built on whoever held the springs and the creek crossings. And the modern conflict over what Texas land is worth, who gets to hold it, and what happens when the ranch economy can no longer justify its value at its sharpest and most consequential. That conflict is a water conflict. Texas has one of the most unusual water law systems in the country. Surface water belongs to the state. Groundwater, however, has historically operated under what was called the rule of capture. If you could pump it from beneath your land, it was yours, regardless of what that pumping did to your neighbor's well. Ranch families with land above productive aquifers held not just grass and cattle, but an underground asset of potentially enormous value. And as Texas grew, and as cities and the energy industry needed vast quantities of water, that underground asset became something that could be sold independently of the surface land above it. In 2012, the Texas Supreme Court ruled in Edwards Aquifer Authority v. Day that landowners have a constitutionally protected property interest in groundwater beneath their land. The decision made groundwater rights more like mineral rights. A real property interest the landowner holds, can sell, can lease, can fight for in court. What it also did was accelerate the commodification of water beneath Texas ranch land. If your groundwater is a property right, it can be valued. If it can be valued, it can be sold. And if it can be sold, the ranch sitting above a productive aquifer is no longer just an agricultural operation. It is a water portfolio. In Pecos County in far west Texas, ranching and farming families arranged to sell 12,000 acre-feet of water annually to oil and gas developers, a deal worth roughly $32.6 million at full production. The land stayed. The fence stayed. The family name might have stayed on the gate. But what the land was producing, and what its future was organized around, had fundamentally changed. Texas water planners have been warning about what comes next for years. The 2022 State Water Plan projects severe shortages under drought conditions, with some regions potentially reaching critical stress levels by as early as 2030. If recommended strategies are not implemented and a major drought arrives. 30 million people growing toward 40 million. In a state that already runs water deficits in dry years, sitting on top of aquifers being drawn down by agriculture, energy, and municipal demand simultaneously, with each user holding a legal right to compete for the same diminishing resource and no obligation to coordinate. This is a critical challenge. The question at the bottom of all this is, when the water that made a ranch viable is sold or pumped away for something else, does the ranch still exist? Does the land still mean what it meant? That decision is happening in documents most people will never read, and it is moving faster than the landscape shows it on the surface. Chapter 13, The Children Who Do Not Come Back. It is worth saying plainly that the children who do not come back are not the problem. This matters because the easiest version of this story puts the blame there. The heirs who chose cities over pastures, careers over cattle, a life with options over a life with obligations. That version is not without emotional truth, but it is not honest, and it does not explain anything. The people who did not come back were not running from the land. Most of them loved it. You do not grow up on a working ranch, waking before school to check on cattle, spending summers in the heat and the dust, learning the names of pastures before you learn the names of cities, without developing a relationship to that place that you carry everywhere else you go. The ones who left carry it still. They carry it in the way they look at land when they drive through open country. They carry it in the guilt that surfaces at family gatherings when someone mentions what the ranch is worth now, what it would take to keep it, what it will probably become. What they could not carry was the economics. The ranch asked for everything and offered, as its return, a life of permanent financial pressure on an asset the market valued far more highly as something other than a ranch. That is not a failure of character. That is a description of a trap. The ones who stayed, who gave their 40s and 50s and 60s to an operation the market kept telling them was worth more sold than continued, those people carry a different weight. They carry the knowledge of the land in a way that nobody who arrives after them will carry it. They know which pasture floods in a wet spring and which holds grass longest in a drought. They know the particular sound the windmill makes when the sucker rod is starting to go. They know the family cemetery on the east side of the property and whose names are on the markers and what those people gave to the place. When those people are gone, that knowledge is gone. It does not transfer with the deed. It does not survive in the county records. It lives in a person, and when the person goes, the land continues under new ownership with no memory of what it was. This is the quietest part of the loss, not the acreage numbers, not the appraisal district records, not the sale prices in the real estate listings, but the knowledge, the specific, irreplaceable, unrecoverable knowledge of how a particular piece of land worked, built up over generations of careful attention, ending with the generation that ran out of time and successes simultaneously. The ranch is not dying because the heirs are weak. It is dying because the world the ranch was built for no longer exists. And the people who stayed to the end, who kept the gate sign up and the cattle on the grass and the windmill turning until they simply could not any more, deserve at minimum the honesty of that explanation. Chapter 14. One elite hands the land to another. The land is not disappearing. The acreage is still there. The mesquite is still there. What is disappearing is the particular set of people and practices and economic relationships that organized that land into something called a ranch. And what is replacing it is not emptiness. It is a different elite with a different relationship to the land and a different set of reasons for holding it. The old ranch elite held land because the land produced something: cattle, wool, oil, water, some combination of resources that justified the holding. The land was working capital. It was supposed to do something. The rancher's identity and the land's productivity were intertwined in a way that made the holding morally legible within the culture. You held the land because the land needed you. The new owners of Texas ranch land do not always need that justification. The buyer who purchases a large hill country tract for recreational use, who runs a few cattle for the exemption and manages the rest for deer and turkey, is not farming in any meaningful sense. But they are holding the land intact with its water, its wildlife, its open sky, and, in many cases, spending money on habitat improvement that a cash-strapped agricultural family could not have afforded. Is that bad for Texas? The honest answer is, it depends on what you think Texas ranch country is for. If it is for wildlife, some of those new owners are doing it better than the ranchers they replaced. If it is for open land, the property is still open. But if it is for the particular human culture that grew up around working the land, the vaquero traditions, the knowledge systems, the community institutions, the small towns built around the economic activity of active ranching, then no amount of recreational management by a buyer from Austin or Dallas or Houston is going to preserve that. That culture requires people who depend on the land economically, who live near enough to maintain it daily, who have children in the local school and names on the local church roll. The amenity buyer does not provide that. They are, for most practical purposes, a neighbor who is never home. Texas working lands saw a market value increase of more than 500% over 25 years. Large operations, the ones over 2,000 acres that are actually capable of running viable commercial cattle businesses, lost more than 1,000 holdings in 5 years. And yet the land itself is not being abandoned. It is being absorbed at high prices by buyers whose relationship to it is fundamentally different from the one it replaced. One elite is handing the land to another. That is not a tragedy in any simple sense. The old elite was not innocent, and the land they held was not always held well. But the replacement raises a question that Texas has not answered. If the land is concentrated in the hands of a new elite whose use of it serves their own preferences rather than the broader agricultural and cultural economy, what exactly has been preserved? The open sky, yes. The wildlife, often. The acreage, technically. But the working order, the human system that organized those acres into something productive and culturally coherent, that is ending. And the thing replacing it is not a continuation of what came before. It is a different arrangement, wearing the same landscape. Power over Texas land has always been concentrated. The question is only who holds the concentration. And the answer is changing, county by county, sale after sale, generation after generation, into something the old gate signs no longer accurately describe. Chapter 15. What survives after ranch country? Texas still leads the nation in cattle. 12.1 million head as of January 1, 2026. 230,000 farms and ranches covering 125 million acres. The cattle are still there. The land is still there. The brand registrations are still processed by the state. The gate signs with the family names are still up on hundreds of county roads. And yet, something is ending. The aggregate of 3.7 million converted acres, 17,000 lost farms, a 55% land value increase in 5 years, 43% of landowners past retirement age, and 1.8 million acres lost in a single half-decade. Those numbers are not describing a stable system under moderate pressure. They are describing a system in the late stages of a structural transition, now accelerating past the point where the usual mechanisms of adaptation can keep pace. The adaptations that saved Texas ranch country before, the shift from open range to fenced operation, the addition of oil and gas income, the productive value tax appraisal, the wildlife management classification, those worked because they gave ranching families a way to hold land, while the economics of a particular era made holding it difficult. What is different now is that the pressure is not a temporary economic condition that a policy adjustment can relieve. The pressure is the permanent structural reality of being a state with 30 million population growing toward 40 million, with a private land system that routes all that growth pressure directly through the market value of the land itself. So what survives? Some of it survives as genuine working agriculture, on properties large enough and water secure enough to make the economics work even in a high land value environment. There will still be cattle in Texas. There will still be ranches. The question is how many, how large, and whether they bear any resemblance to the cultural form the word ranch has historically described. Some of it survives as amenity landscape, large properties held by wealthy buyers for recreational and conservation purposes, managed for wildlife and scenery. The land stays open. The wildlife benefits. But the human culture that once organized the land is not preserved with it. Some of it survives as a brand. The word ranch applied to things that have almost no operational connection to the ranching tradition: residential developments with ranch-themed names, weekend properties with a few cattle kept for the exemption, agritourism operations that sell the aesthetic of ranch country to visitors who want to touch it without living inside it. The image persists after the reality has largely gone. And some of it does not survive at all. It becomes subdivision roads and commercial frontage and the infrastructure of a growing state that needs places to put its people and its industries and its highways. What Texas will preserve, longer than it preserves the material reality of ranch country, is the idea of it, the image, the mythology. Texas will keep selling that image to itself long after the thing the image refers to has largely been converted, fragmented, sold, and replaced. Every civilization preserves the image of what it valued after it can no longer preserve the thing itself. The mythology stays. The mythology is easier to maintain than the reality. The mythology does not require water rights or intergenerational succession or the willingness of the next generation to give their lives to a piece of ground. Texas ranch country was built by an empire and sustained by dynasties and mythologized as timeless. It was built by people who took land from other people under the authority of a legal system that rewarded those with access to it. It was sustained by people willing to adapt, to take the oil money, to take the tax exemption, to take the wildlife classification when the original justification stopped paying. And it was mythologized as timeless because every territorial order needs a story about permanence, and Texas needed a very big one. The order underneath the story is failing, not because of villains, not because of a single catastrophe, not because the wrong people made the wrong choices, because the logic that held it together, land at scale, held by dynasties, justified by production, protected by law, and reproduced through inheritance, has met a set of pressures it was not designed to survive. Rising values, aging owners, mobile heirs, thirsty aquifers, a market that sees the land as an asset class before it sees it as a ranch. The gate signs, if they stay up at all, will be pointing at something the families who put them there would not entirely recognize. The land remains. The story is changing underneath it. And the argument about what was lost and whether it deserved to last and whose loss it actually was, that argument will outlast the ranches themselves. It already has.